to episode 426 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Michael O'Malley,
Nadine Smith.
And in today's episode, we're going to continue our Horror for Kids series with 2018's The House with a Clock in Its Walls. And then in part one, we're going to do movies that we saw this week, which also kind of lean into the Eli Roth angle, since we're talking about an Eli Roth movie. So, perfect setup. Real quick, be sure to check cinematary.com. We're going to have reviews up soon of the TIFF movies that we saw. So check it, find those hopefully by the end of the month at the website. But let's go ahead and start talking about some movies. Michael, I'm going to kick it off with you. Had you not seen any Eli Roth movies and you're trying to kind of journey through it, or what's...
Yeah, basically, I had seen Cabin Fever, which I think is his directorial debut or something, which is just like okay. So like a bunch of irritating people get killed in a cabin. But I signed up for this because I was thinking maybe this is my time to get on the Eli Roth train, because there is a train full of Eli Roth fans, and I thought, let's see what they're up to. And so I actually reached out to Nadine and said, what should I watch? And Nadine suggested I watch the Hostel movies, the first two, I guess. And then also...
I am a defender, apologist, perhaps.
Yeah, they were good. They were good. But the one I want to talk about is the other one you recommended, which is Knock Knock from 2015. And so... I queued up Knock Knock after watching the Hostel movies and liking them to like a pretty decent degree. And Knock Knock stars Keanu Reeves, who is this guy it's Father's Day. Like the movie opens up and it's Father's Day, and his wife is like wishing him happy Father's Day, and then his kids come and wish him happy Father's Day, and he seems real happy, right? He's got this nice domestic life, and his family goes away for like the weekend, but he has to stay home and work on Father's Day. Or I guess they're gone for the day. I'm not really sure. It feels like a weekend, even though Father's Day is usually a Sunday. It doesn't really matter, though. The important thing is, while his family is gone, there's a torrential rain, and during this torrential rain, these two young ladies knock on the door, hence the title of the movie. And he opens the door, and they're like, Uber has dropped them off in the wrong place, and they're supposed to be across town, and so I have to call another Uber to get across town, but because it's like a rainy weekend night, there's not a lot of people Ubering, so they got to wait like 45 minutes for their next Uber. And while they're waiting, they're just kind of like hanging around Keanu's house. And it turns out Keanu Reeves used to be a DJ in his former life before he had kids and such. And
he collects vinyl.
He makes a big point of collecting vinyl, and like explaining the vinyl to these women. And they seem really interested, and eventually it becomes clear that they're like coming on to him and like want to have sex with him, and he's all like, oh no, I'm a married man, I'm happily married. But so he's like killing time until their Uber comes, while also like theoretically at least like kind of trying not to have sex with these women who are like almost literally throwing themselves at him by the end of this. And
Isn't one of them Ana de Armas?
Yeah. I forgot about this. So one of the women is actually Lorenza Izzo.
Oh, yeah.
Who is
she's in this movie.
Yeah. So she's I think she's married to Eli Roth. Is that correct? Yeah, she's married to Eli Roth.
Yeah, I think so.
And then the other one is Ana de Armas, which is the earliest role that I've seen her in. I don't know what else that she's been in before this. But anyway, so these two people are like, come on, just, monogamy is a social construct, blah, blah, blah. Like, and while they're doing this, they're getting increasingly like undressed as well, because for like seemingly innocent reasons, like, oh, our clothes are wet because of the rain. And Keanu's like, hey, I'm going to go throw them in the dryer. And so like, honestly, like the first like 30 minutes of this movie is really, really funny, because it's it's basically like a porn setup, and like, but Keanu is like refusing to admit that he's in this setup for a very long time. It's almost like the beginning of oh shoot, how am I forgetting? Shaun, yeah, it's almost like the beginning of Shaun of the Dead, how like for the first 30 minutes no one sees the zombies around them because they're oblivious.
Oh,
And
yeah.
like Keanu's kind of doing that, except that he's in porn. But finally, he kind of succumbs to the pressure, and they get fairly coercive. And I don't know, like one of the interesting things is like the extent to which like the sex that he eventually has with these two people is consensual or not. Because he objects pretty vehemently at times, but regardless, they do the deed all night long apparently, and he wakes up in the morning, and they're still there. They've missed their Uber, and they're still in his house. And
I hate it when that happens.
And they've turned. I saw someone on Letterboxd compare this movie to Gremlins, and like in a certain way that's like apt, because he fed them after midnight basically, and they've turned into mayhem. Like he wakes up and they've cooked breakfast, but they've like trashed the kitchen and doing so. They're like throwing pancakes across the room and things like that. And they just won't leave his house anymore. And eventually they start trying to blackmail him because, they have evidence now that he's slept with them. And not only has he now cheated on his wife, but they also tell him that they are underage, which is like a note of ambiguity in the movie, because there's other stuff in the movie that indicates that they are in fact lying about that, but it's not clear. And so then the movie devolves into basically like a home invasion movie in which like these people that he invited in and had sex with will not leave. They like simply will not leave his house, and then they start torturing him.
Simply Boone-Wellian.
It truly is. They start torturing him first psychologically and then like actually physically, and it gets pretty grody by the end, and that's kind of like the movie, and I liked it. I thought it was really funny, like, to be honest. Like, one of the things I had heard about Eli Roth is like, oh, his movies are funny. These are all like horror comedies, and I didn't really feel that to a great extent in like Hostel. Like, there's an element of humor in those movies, but those movies are very grim. And this movie, though, is just very funny. Like, not just the setup, but also like where this movie eventually goes. It like escalates in absurdity to points that I think are like amusing, and they're also kind of gross though too. And like that's kind of like the tension of the movie, is that there's like this kind of like amusing like absurdity that's also grounded in like these weird gender politics, and I'm not exactly sure how to sort them out, and I'm curious if Nadine maybe has more insight being a fan. But it's like in some ways it's like the like middle-aged heterosexual man's like worst nightmare, of like this is like a pre-Me Too movie, but it like has like elements of that where he's like, I was coerced into sleeping with these young women who the next morning then say that I have like abused them and raped them and all that, but I was the victim. And like it's very much a movie that can play into that, but then there's also like a lot of stuff in the movie that is deeply ambiguous about Keanu's character and like the extent to which
he's
a good
very unlikable, and like very much this sort of like, you know, like the sort of detail about him being this like vinyl snob. He's like just sort of this spoiled, kind of aloof, like,
yeah,
you know, and so it writes that line of like, you know, is he indulging here? Like, is he being, you know, sort of passive and sort of entertaining their company when he could maybe be like ushering them out a little bit more aggressively? Or, you know, is he genuinely being sort of, you know, violated? It sort of asks that question of like, what's the power dynamic?
It does,
here?
and he has this,
you know, it's pretty constantly
he has
shifting.
this speech near the end of the movie that is honestly hilarious. Do you remember the free pizza speech, Nadine?
yeah
Because at the end of the movie he's like so mad at these girls/women, like, you know, it's unclear what their age is, actually, but he's so mad at them, and he gives this like rant that honestly it feels like a Brett Kavanaugh like style rant, like, you know, being, you know, in front of the Supreme Court or something like that, where he is like justifying himself and his behavior, but the way that he does so is really weird and revealing. Like he is like, I was just minding my own business. You guys came to my house and then just started throwing yourself at me. It was like free pizza. What was I supposed to do? I don't know. There's just something very revealing and weird about like him saying that these women are like free pizza. I don't know. But it's also very funny because Keanu is like peak Keanu in this movie in the sense of like he's like kind of stilted and has this, Keanu has this like I can't mimic him, but a lot of people make fun of his limited acting in like stuff like Bram Stoker's Dracula or something like that, and like this movie is kind of leaning into his like stiltedness, and it's.
But I feel like the kind of opinion, the critical opinion, has changed a lot on Keanu. I mean, he's always had his fans and defenders, but I just feel like the overall opinion of him the past few years, and a lot of it is like his public persona and whatnot, but it's just become like much more positive overwhelmingly, I feel like, than it kind of was in the past, and people were much more like were much more likely to make jokes about that kind of stiltedness and the sort of like Bill and Ted dumb surfer guy affect or whatever. And I feel like this is the rare, because I don't know, now he's, I mean, I'm trying to think of like the most recent thing I saw him in, but maybe it's just the like nature of John Wick or something being kind of different, but I feel like Knock Knock is like the rare movie recently that like plays into, because something like John Wick plays into another part of his persona, which is like the action hero, badass, Matrix, Point Break, etc. Like, and this goes into that's Bram Stoker, like The Lake House, that sort of like melodramatic, weird Keanu, where it's like he's trying to convince you he's a real human, and there's something that feels sort of strange about it, like almost like Putty from Seinfeld a little bit, or something like. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I like this movie, as with a lot of Eli Roth. Like it rides. It's very provocative, like intentionally so, and is
definitely
really rides a fine line in terms of like it finds like the kind of like nerve, like the open like nervy topics, and like really pokes at them in ways that are like uncomfortable to deal with, but also like with plausible deniability of like, oh, am I really making this kind of like reactionary, like, anti-women movie, or is it actually, a commentary on this? Like, there's a lot of like that. And I felt like that's like a through line in all of the Eli Roth movies I've seen, is that playing with really hot button issues in a way that doesn't like have a very clear theme or motive. And so it leaves you like, a big part of the movie is kind of questioning what those motives are. And being kind of fascinated by the possibilities of what they could be, while also kind of like feeling a little gross and repulsed in a way. I don't know. That was my kind of feeling on Knock Knock.
Yeah. No, it's, I don't think this movie was like a deliberate influence or conscious influence when he was going in, but there is an interview from when the movie came out where the interviewer asks him if he's seen a movie that has been discussed on the podcast before, I think, a few years ago, but Daisies.
It is 100%.
Chitlova film. And he's like, oh yeah, like totally, I like that movie. Like I could totally see the comparison there. Like, somebody should program that as a double feature. Haha, So I don't think that was a conscious influence, but I do think it hits this very similar kind of point of just like, and I mentioned like Buñuel sort of jokingly earlier, but I think there's some of that energy and even a little, another problematic filmmaker, but there's definitely some like kind of 60s, 70s Polanski vibes, like The Tenant or something, where it's this kind of isolated, bottled up space and like things are going haywire and it's a little bit theatrical, and then kind of like the bottled, isolated location and the premise. I feel like, but I feel like there is that kind of like sort of 60s kind of like satirical comedy of like, manners, social norms kind of thing, where it's just like a very different sort of socio-political movie or whatever you want to call it than like usually I feel like is made now. I feel like now, especially in this isn't like a quite a clear horror movie in the way that something like Hostel is. I feel like it's got that sort of thrillery. I don't know. It's just it's got multiple tones, which Eli Roth usually does. But I just feel like it it's like so many horror movies now are very kind of directly stating their themes and intentions and metaphors and stuff, and I feel like Eli Roth throws a lot of contentious, complicated things out there, but it never really quite lands in one direction. And so there is that element, like you said, of like it does sort of feel like there is an element of like maybe Eli Roth himself even kind of has these feelings or illicit desires, especially casting his wife in
sure.
it, being a middle-aged man himself. Like there is that kind of self-implication a little bit, which in some ways like makes it maybe more problematic, but in other ways also makes it more like aware of itself maybe, because I feel like he is a little bit more willing to like acknowledge him. I don't know, just the way he kind of casts himself, like sometimes even in like bit parts and stuff in his movies as like in Hostel, I think he's like in the background or whatever, is like a dumb tourist in a club, and I think Cabin Fever also he's like another kind of like very Scooby-Doo like character, and I feel like that willingness to sort of like he is very much in some ways like a film school bro, like that's his sort of background, but there is a real, I think, sort of a good-naturedness a little bit in a weird way, which is a weird word to apply to him, but just in terms of like he is willing to sort of take himself down a few pegs, and I think that it's it's almost kind of a like Brian De Palma thing a little bit, where it's just like there's a lot of weird gaze and desire and stuff sort of being acknowledged and played with, and it doesn't really go one way or the other.
Yeah, it definitely. I haven't seen the movie, but like to your point, I think a lot of the kind of well-regarded horror movies today, it very much is like going, this is what it's about, and like we're going to tell you about that. It's usually trauma because they're not that unique, and so it's like trauma, that's what we're going to be talking about or something. It's very telegraphed on like what they're talking about, and it's almost like a lecture where it's like just follow this and take notes. And from what you're describing, it seems like this more, it has those ideas, but it's not about that. It's just those are just kind of baked into the story itself and are kind of coming out of that naturally. And it's not saying that whether it's good or bad, it's just kind of saying this is just some weird shit happening in the mind. And yeah, I agree, that's not necessarily what you find in a lot of modern horror movies, or not modern, but like recent horror movies.
I think there's like I think one of the things that's like very pronounced in this movie and also the Hostel movies though is also this kind of impishness in realizing that like the moment he does certain things in the movie, people are going to start to try to look for those like telegraphed messages, and then he like refuses to give them at all. Like the Hostel movies are very much like informed by like American intervention in like Afghanistan and stuff. Like they're like the imagery is like straight from like Abu Ghraib and like Guantanamo and like all those sort of things. But there's like a refusal to like make a, it's not a refusal to make a thesis, but it's a refusal to like have a thesis that is like easily parsed as like a single like thematic statement or something. And
also his Death Wish remake is very much the same way, where it's like constantly with a lot of the sort of signifiers it uses, it's like, is this legitimately reactionary, or is this like a representation of the paranoid delusions of a conspiratorial middle-aged white man who's like losing his grip on society? And it kind of goes back and forth where it's like, what is the perspective here? Is it sincere? Is it ironic?
Yeah. Well, the other movie...
Which, like, in that movie, there's an incredible image where Bruce Willis reads Milton Friedman to his daughter in a coma. So,
true horror.
Do with that what you will. Yeah.
The other movie I wanted to talk about came directly out of this, because after I finished Knock Knock, I looked it up on Wikipedia, and it turns out that it's a remake of a 70s movie. So in a sense, it makes sense that we were just comparing this to like kind of older horrors like from the 70s and stuff, because this is like in a lot of ways beat for beat like a 70s movie called Death Game, which stars Colleen Camp as like the Ana de Armas character, and then let's see, who's the other person in this? Someone named Sandra Locke. I'm not familiar with her. Colleen Camp actually.
Oh, she was married to Clint Eastwood.
No way! Wow, a lot of wives in these movies.
They worked together on a lot of things.
Colleen Camp makes a bit appearance in Knock Knock. She's the concerned neighbor who shows up.
Oh my god, I forgot that.
But she's like one of the gremlins in this movie. And this movie, like, honestly, this movie took Knock Knock down a couple pegs for me because it is so... If I had watched this movie first, Knock Knock wouldn't have felt so intriguing. It's kind of like one of those where it's like so close. And also like the film style is unhinged. Like it's completely unhinged. Whereas like Knock Knock is very like smooth and considered, which is kind of like Eli Roth's thing. He's very technically precise. Whereas this movie was made with this, like the set and the shooting was like chaotic apparently because there were like financial problems that halted production at multiple points. People apparently were like just miserable and didn't get along with each other and stuff. And so I think this movie was kind of stitched together in the editing room, and as a result, just feels, I don't know, it feels like brushing up against like psychedelic film or something like that, while at the same time like hitting the same beats as are in that movie. And I actually like this movie better than Knock Knock. I mean, they're both worth watching if any of this sounds interesting, but this is the one that feels like, I don't know, maybe it's just me preferring like that kind of like grimy, like 70s, like grindhouse aesthetic. But like there is something about this movie, like I like very much feels like Daisies, like, and it's not just like the style of the film, but like the way that the girls act is like much more chaotic. Like the girls in Knock Knock are they're sinister and calculating, and I mean they're eventually kind of chaotic as well, but it's always like very calculated and thought through, or it seems to be thought through, whereas the girls in this movie are like completely out of completely out of control in a way that very much feels like Daisies. There's even a bunch of like food destruction in this movie, like there is in Daisies, and in fact, like they get so busy like throwing food around and throwing it at this middle-aged man that they have like tied up, that they run out of food and have to order groceries because they forgot that they also need to eat, as they're like keeping this guy hostage. And so there's like that sort of stuff that kind of indicates that they're just really acting off of the cuff. The middle-aged guy in this movie, the Keanu character, is like kind of like he's just a lot more obviously gross, and maybe it's just a difference in time period. Like someone from like a well-to-do middle-aged man in the 70s just scans as grosser to us now than like a well-to-do middle-aged man in the 2010s.
That's nice.
But he
at least we progressed in how middle-aged men are
maybe. I mean, maybe it's just a context thing. But he's got like the classic like porn stash. He's got in fact, like when he's having the threesome with the women, there's like legit like porn music, like the kind of like slap bass sort of thing going on. Yeah, it like really leans into like the porn stuff, which makes sense because like a lot of exploitation film at the time was just like in the same like bubbling in the same waters as like actual porn. So it makes sense that there's like a crossover like that's much more conscious in this movie. But at any rate, Death Game is really cool and really wild, and it's the kind of movie that feels like you're watching it and you're just being like shaken by the movie the whole time because it's just like flipping everywhere, and there's these like wild like dissolves. In fact, like the like kind of sex montage is like there's like 3 or 4 dissolves of like sexual acts on top of each other. So it's just like this like swirling phantasmagoric miasma of like human skin just like swirling in front of you like as the like porn music plays. And I don't know, like I recommend seeking this movie. I'm recommending both movies, but like, if you got to watch one, I would say Death Game is the one. I didn't finish, though. The guy who the guy who is the Keanu character is played by Seymour Castle, and like I said, he's a lot more gross. He's a lot more. There's a lot less characterization of him in this movie. He almost is like a symbol or an archetype, because you like the amount of time that it takes between him, the beginning of the movie, and then him like sleeping with these women is like maybe under 10 minutes. Like the movie like speeds through that, and so there's a lot less of this like we're kind of analyzing his happy home life, and then we're analyzing like his record collection and stuff like that. He's just, I think he's like on the phone with like a business partner or something, like chuckling about like some business deal, and he's got this gross like stash, and he's just like, you know, he's basically just like sitting on top of the world and just like chuckling. And then in come these two women who like immediately humiliate him like after sex, and just like it just is deranged and like a lot more pointed. And I don't know that this movie really lends itself to a theme, like, but it's also not coy about what it's doing like Eli Roth can be. Like, it's very much like, this dude is the worst, and we're going to show you a movie in which he's just humiliated for like an hour. Which
That's funny because I feel like more like in terms of recent context, people know Seymour Castle from being Max Fisher's dad in Rushmore.
Oh my god!
I think he was in a couple other Wes Anderson
that.
movies. Yeah.
No way. Yeah, this is Wes Anderson could never make this movie.
I would be super down to watch a Wes Anderson, what you just described as Death Game, but Wes Anderson makes it. Wes Anderson should make just a movie where people fuck. That would be weird.
I will say the one like Wes Anderson element of this movie, now that we mention it, is there's like this repeated song throughout, because it's like a 70s movie, and what would a 70s movie be without like just 2 or 3 songs on the soundtrack that you repeat multiple times? And there's this song called let me see if I can find the title of it, but it's like this like really jaunty, like sounds like it's like a Shirley Temple musical song or something like that, about like how awesome Good Old Dad is the name of the song that it opens the movie, and it's like this like jaunty like old school musical song about like how nice dad is and how he taught me all these manners or whatever. And then so like as you see this businessman like chortling about business, is playing that song, and then like it plays that song periodically throughout the rest of the movie while these women are just like brutalizing him. I don't know, it's like the only thing that feels Wes Anderson-y is like having this like semi-ironic like vintage song that plays at certain points. Anyway, I've talked a lot about my 2 movies, but they're both worth watching. Different vibes, but very similar plots.
Well, Knock Knock. I just looked. I'll just say, so Lorenza Izzo, or whatever her name is, and Eli Roth got divorced in 2019.
When?
2019. So.
Oh, I thought you said 2016. I was like, it was the movie.
I mean,
so sorry.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, this is kind of a weird movie to make with the person you're. Yeah, it's a little Eyes Wide Shut.
Yeah.
Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman kind of vibe going on.
All right, well, Nadine, I'm going to toss it over to you to talk a little bit about another nice horror auteur, modern horror auteur, Rob Zombie.
Yeah, and another wife guy, I guess.
Big
also,
old wife guy.
Because a slightly bigger wife guy, because they are still together and seem to perhaps always, you know, they seem very deeply in love, because the films of Mr. Robert Zombie are pretty much all of them, I think, star his wife, Sherry Moon Zombie, in a pretty major capacity. And even like Halloween 2, you know, she's like a phantasm or something, and he just finds his excuse to sneak her in there. And even though his movies are very violent and frequently very depraved, there is a lot of love in them. And The Munsters is very fittingly a love story about Herman Munster and whatever his the Bride of Munsters.
The Bride of Munsters.
Mrs. Munster.
I don't know, the spooky Count Chocula, like
Lily Munster.
There we go.
I like the
Lily
Bride of Munster, though.
Her search for a sufficiently undead husband to be betrothed to. You know, she's living with her like vampire count's dad, uncle, older relative, guardian figure, and he's like, oh, no, trying to set her up with all these like frigid ghouls, and she's like, no, I want someone to eat brains with or something, I don't know, and she one day catches the eye of Herman Munster, who has been brought to life through a scientific experiment, much like the monster of Frankenstein. And he is like some genius brain being put in a I don't know, one of those kind of things. Some Gollum stuff. But the experiment goes wrong, and but he's like this artistic genius. He's basically kind of like the Joker, like in the Joker being a stand-up comic. Like he's doing this weird like performance art, and he's this like sensitive, creative soul. He's in a like noise band. Actually, it seems to be very perhaps something of a indirect adaptation of the story of Rob Zombie and Sherry Moon Zombie falling in love, because much like the band of Herman Munster in this film, Rob Zombie's musical career, of course, and the band White Zombie actually began as something, that one of the more famous bands that is associated with the new metal category in the 1990s. But they actually started as like something much more of a noise art rock project and they were students at the Pratt Institute in New York, and so kind of coming out of that like New York downtown scene a little bit. And I think you can see that and hear that in Rob Zombie's music and in his movies. There's a very kind of like collage element. I mean, you can tell fittingly that his dream project, aside from a biopic of Groucho Marx, which hopefully will someday still happen, but The Munsters was his dream project because he's a huge fan. And there is a kind of like channel changing element to a lot of his work, where there's just like all of these little quotations, things pulled from various old horror movies. He's a huge fan of the Universal monster movies. I feel like, in his Halloween remakes, he almost treats Michael Myers as more like a sort of Frankenstein type tragic figure, as opposed to this sort of just like vessel for violence that is the kind of original John Carpenter, imagination of it. He's kind of interested in, and then something like The Devil's Rejects 2 is like, does ask you in a weird way to like have some kind of empathy for these like horrible, violent people. And I feel like that's just kind of like very much what a quality that the early old school monster movies that we think of have. I feel like there was this just sort of like, the tragic downfall of, the outsider scientist whose experiment goes wrong or whatever, the tragic count, and like, all of that kind of stuff. There's always this just sort of like pity the monster, kind of element to it. So it makes sense. I feel like that he would be attracted to something like The Munsters, which is like, turning literally monsters and horror into a sitcom and into this family friendly kind of thing. And so a lot of that the movie is this just like love story between Herman and Lily. And so it's obviously a very different tone than most of Rob Zombie's movies, which have frequently skirted the line of NC-17. I think House of a Thousand Corpses sat on the studio shelf for like a couple of years because he really just was like, this is probably my one shot at a movie. Let's just go all out. Of course, it was not the only movie he made, but all his movies consistently since then have gone pretty all out in terms of content. And a fitting kind of connection to, we were just talking about Eli Roth, and this, much like the movie we'll be talking about next, House with a Clock in Its Walls, this is, a sort of child-friendly foray for a really grisly horror filmmaker. And both of those dudes were included in the original essay that coined the infamous term torture porn, which I believe was written by David Edelstein for New York Magazine in like 2004, 2005. And it's a really interesting list of movies because you can see how, like, why they were lumped together, but on their own, they're all very different movies. You have Hostel by, of course, Mr. Eli Roth, the first Saw movie, Wolf Creek, which the interesting thing is just like all of these movies are kind of read as very American, like Iraq War related, and obviously the Iraq Afghanistan were like international conflicts and stuff, but Wolf Creek is an Australian slasher. The Devil's Rejects by Rob Zombie, and The Passion of the Christ was also included in that lineup of torture porn movies, which, like, you know, you can make a case, I think. But they are pretty different movies, and, like, The Devil's Rejects, I think, is, like, very much in this kind of, like, 70s, almost like the Wild Bunch, Bonnie and Clyde type mode. So, you know, Rob Zombie works a lot in these kind of, like, homage, vaguely, like, Tarantino-ish style. So The Munsters in some ways is it's a weirdly, like, faithful adaptation in that it's just, like, feels like a TV show. It just has this very sort of, like, episodic, lackadaisical quality. It's just kind of a vibe movie. It's very colorful. It has a very weird, you know, it feels very stagey, very, you know, like a set, you know, like it could have been filmed with a live audience. And in some ways it almost feels like a bid for a pilot for a reboot of The Munsters, because it ends with them, like, going to Hollywood, ending up in the real human world from this, like, perpetually Transylvania, like, alternate reality that they inhabit. They, like, come into the real world of the suburbs and live in their house, and then at the end of the movie, sort of reverse Wizard of Oz, it goes to black and white, and then you have the end credits, which are the opening credits of the show. So all in all, you know, it's definitely necessarily not up there for me with the best works of Rob Zombie, which are really gut-wrenching and emotional and almost like Lynchian a little bit for me. But I did enjoy it quite a bit. It's very colorful. It's very fun. There's a song called Disco Vampire in it. That's a big bop, kind of. My one complaint is that one of my favorite on-screen performers, Mr. Kevin Nash, actor, you know, star of such films as Magic Mike XXL, professional wrestler, former basketball player for the University of Tennessee. He said in a recent interview with Stone Cold Steve Austin that Herman Munster was his dream role because, you know, he's a big guy but a gentle giant, and he does act and is in a lot of things, mostly like direct-to-video bullshit, and, you know, there's just like that kind of performer who's very physically imposing and large. You know, there's not a lot of more like sensitive roles, and Herman Munster is a very sensitive character. So I am kind of disappointed that I don't even know who it is. Who's Herman Munster?
Jeff Daniel Phillips.
Yeah, there's some. It's a very weird cat. Like, there's not really any stars in this movie. It's sort of odd.
Yeah, this guy hasn't done, like, you could have just had Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash honestly would have been like the biggest name of the movie. Yeah, no,
and that's the kind of the one thing that is a little odd about it is I'm just like, I don't exactly know how Rob Zombie made, because it is a, you know, intellectual property. So it could be a franchise starter or whatever, but it's just this weird little love story with like no name actors in it. So I guess he just made it so cheaply that they were just like, what the hell? We'll put it on Netflix. But, you know, it's on Netflix. It's a good time. So this year's Hubie Halloween. While we wait for Hubie Halloween 2.
I gotta do my annual rewatch of Hubie Halloween, which sickens Andrew, so it's really fun. All right, well, we're gonna take a quick break, and then we're gonna talk about that old house with a clock in its wall after this. part 2 of episode 426 of Cinematary. In this part, we're going to be continuing our not young critics, holy shit, I'm so tired, our Horror for Kids series with 2018's
young horror
young horror for old critics.
Young Horror for Old Critics series with 2018's The House with a Clock in Its Walls. Directed by Eli Roth, from a script by...
Movies were too old to be watching.
Yeah, that's true. No, I'm off it. Directed by Eli Roth from a script by Eric Kripke, based on the novel of the same name by John Bellairs. The film stars Jack Black, Cate Blanchett, Owen Vaccaro, and Kyle MacLachlan. 10-year-old Lewis goes to live with his oddball uncle in a creaky old house that contains a mysterious tick-tock noise. He soon learns...
TikTok.
Yeah, right? It's real timely. He soon learns...
Also, I'm sorry, but I said to myself in my head, Kyle MacLachlan. And I can't stop thinking about that.
We're here all night, folks. He soon learns that Uncle Jonathan and his feisty neighbor, Mrs. Zimmerman, all right, that's an adjective, are powerful...
Colleen Camp, by the way.
Yeah, that's true. Are powerful practitioners of the magic arts. When Lewis accidentally awakens the dead, the town's sleepy facade suddenly springs to life, revealing a secret and dangerous world of witches, warlocks, and deadly curses. That describes nothing of what happens in this movie.
And boy witches.
Boy witches.
That's right. He has a real hard time with the term warlock.
Eli Roth, talking about why he chose to make this movie in a 2018 interview with Collider, said, "I understand that I've certainly branded myself and marketed myself that way, so I understand why people would think of me that way, but think about my favorite directors like Sam Raimi and Peter Jackson, and I look at their early movies and where they went in their careers. I remember when I thought, wow, Sam Raimi is doing Spider-Man. I want to see what the guy who did Evil Dead will do with Spider-Man. And I wanted to see what Peter Jackson, the guy who did Bad Taste and Meet the Feebles, would do with Lord of the Rings and how he would apply that sensibility to the fantasy genre. So I always looked at myself as hoping to have that kind of career trajectory, like Guillermo del Toro, Sam Raimi, Tim Burton, and Peter Jackson. I've wanted to do a Terry Gilliam Time Bandits kind of movie, and I said to my agents...
He is just dropping names.
He is.
Man.
He said, find me a Time Bandits, otherwise I'll just have to write something. They were like, he did Hostel, how are we going to fund that? But that's where Steven Spielberg and Amblin came in. Steven loves Hostel. He saw it and got it and said, quote, yeah, I completely get how this could translate.
That man is a freak.
The director of Jaws went on to make E.T. That makes perfect sense in his head. So he really backed me and supported me. When I think back to my childhood, those violent movies that I've known for now, I didn't know until I was maybe 12 or 13 and they were on VHS at a sleepover. The movies that I saw in theater when I was 9, 10, 11, and 12 were those scary Amblin movies that were everything to me. Like E.T., Raiders, Gremlins, Goonies, Poltergeist, and even
Harry
Ghostbusters.
And the Hendersons.
Harry and the Hendersons. There were other oddball movies like Time Bandits where the kids' parents blow up at the end and a guy gets turned into a pig. That was mind-blowing as a child. I had never seen anything like that. There were other movies like Dragon Slayer, The Dark Crystal, and Labyrinth that were much closer to Grimm's fairy tales where characters die. They're very dark stories that aren't always funny, but those are the movies that were gateway drug movies. Those were the movies that got you into scary movies.
And you wonder why he is friends with Quentin Tarantino.
Exactly, right. Roth on the scene, the automaton scene. I just added this because it's really funny. I love creepy automatons. I said to Steven Spielberg, I was like, I want to have a scene where the automatons attack. And Steven said, I love automatons. I collect automatons. My kids won't let me put them in the house because they say they're too creepy. He has them packed away in crates. He has a warehouse with crates of automatons. He said, can I put them in the movie? And he was like, really? You want to put my automatons in the movie? And I was like, of course, Steven Spielberg. I'd like to use your automatons. There's a history with magicians and automatons, and I thought, what if they came to life and attack? They could be one of my signature scenes. Our art department was so into building the automatons. They're all horror fans who are tatted up, and they wanted to have a real satanic-looking one. We named all of them. I sat in the room with those automatons and thought, I just want to live here.
It's like his Seinfeld bit. They're just saying the word automaton over and over again. I'm also convinced now that Steven Spielberg's ostensible warehouse full of automatons is the Area 51 from Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Honestly, I just want to read
Rose.
Eli Roth interviews about this movie. They're all like that wild.
The quotes that you read were more entertaining than the movie itself.
Jack Black on the Horror for Kids angle in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. Things have changed, obviously, because of the YouTubes. Kids are exposed to some things that they didn't used to be, so sadly, yeah, there might be a little bit of numbness. But this is an opportunity for us to curate a good, scary experience that doesn't include anything that's too nightmare-inducing. That was definitely part of the appeal of doing the movie.
That dang Slender Man.
It's like a movie you take the kids to and not worry that they're going to be too freaked out. The New York Times in 2018 said the pleasures of the movie are mainly in the design of the Victorian house and its grounds, replete with a chair that behaves like a dog, and in the affection for recreating the 1950s period, down to the surprise use of Ovaltine. Mr. Black is perhaps too sardonic a presence, but Miss Blanchett, as a fellow spellcaster, takes evident pleasure in deadpanning lines like, "I melted Salvador Dali's watch once," right off his wrist. Playing material like this with conviction is its own form of magic. And the LA Times in 2018 said, for all its loud wallpaper and diverting CGI bric-a-brac, this lavish reimagining of Casa Benevolent, whatever the hell Jack Black's character is, cannot quite compete with the book's illustrations rendered by the great Edward Gorey for sheer evocative strangeness. Still, there is plenty to marvel at here with the sentimental jack-o'-lanterns and flatulent plant sculptures to the stained glass window, whose colorful images seem to morph every hour. On that note, House with a Clock at its walls. Nadine, I'm curious, had you seen this before as like an Eli Roth person, or was this the first time?
I had not, actually. This is the last of his feature films that I have not seen. And, I was definitely curious because it seemed like an outlier, and I was sort of interested to see him do that kind of homage to the many films that he listed off in that interview that you quoted.
I can't even name three of them.
I don't even know the last movie that had an Amblin Entertainment card at the beginning of it. I don't know what even.
I was halfway convinced when I watched it because they have the old Universal logo at the beginning too, and I was like, is this just a bit? Is it just pretending to be an older movie? But no, it's real. But for a half second, I was like, maybe this is just part of the pastiche.
And I'm always, sort of interested by movies like this where they're intentionally, a filmmaker who's really kind of typecast, I guess, whatever the directorial equivalent of that is trying to stretch their normal boundaries a little bit. Okay, I'm pulling up Amblin Entertainment. Oh wow, there's a lot more Amblin movies than I thought. Most of the Spielberg things, but Cats, A Dog's Purpose, A Dog's Journey, The 100-Foot Journey, some J.J. Abrams movies. A movie that I was thinking about while watching this, Monster House. Wow, that's also an Amblin movie. That's basically kind of the same movie. Monster House, The Living House. And there's...
Yes, the Cats you're thinking about, Michael. It is an Amblin movie.
There's a lot of, there's some interesting things about this movie. But it is definitely, I think, a little bit of a, for the auteurs, for the real fans. If you're convince me that Eli Roth is an interesting filmmaker, I don't think I would necessarily direct you towards The House with a Clock and Its Walls first. There are those kind of genuine, I feel sort of elements of those kind of Amblin movies. I was thinking a little bit in some of the effects and stuff, part where the stained glass is making words. It's kind of some of those early Industrial Light and Magic special effects movies, Young Sherlock Holmes and I don't know, just that kind of young adult movie. And it's sort of, but the thing about it is it's not really that much of a departure for Eli Roth in a lot of ways, because it's still pretty gross and horrific. And
the barfing pumpkins are pretty gross.
And Michael, you mentioned when talking about Knock Knock just his sort of like formal elegance. So like I can see why he would be attracted to the idea of a haunted house movie, because like I don't know, you watch something like the Conjuring movies and those feel almost like amusement park rides a little bit. Like there's just a lot of things going on and kind of contraptions, and like you have a very just like sense of space. And I felt like this movie never really had a clearly defined like sense of space. It's very surprisingly kind of dim and like washed out. And I was watching the credits and I spotted the little state of Georgia peach, and I just feel like that just kind of says a lot about the visual style, where it's that sort of like just totally green screen warehouse like previs sort of.
They filmed it in Atlanta.
Yeah, so it has the sort of Marvel sort of sheen to it a little bit. I mean, it really, like, in terms of the color palette and stuff, isn't that different than, like, Doctor Strange or something. Like, there's some nice details, but...
Can I interrupt? Like, what has happened to, like, effects-driven movies, or even, like, not effects-driven, like, movies, like, that are, like, digital film movies, like, are so hard to watch these days because of the color and the lighting is just so dim. Like, I watched the new Predator movie, Prey, and which was, like, pretty good, but it was hard to watch because it was, the lighting, like,
dude, you should watch an episode of, like, Game of Thrones. It's I'd rather, like, it's terrible.
Like, why?
I don't know. It's terrible.
Like, this is a tangent, but what has happened? I watched a movie from, like, 10 years ago, and it's, like, the colors pop even on a movie that's not like meant to have popping colors. Like I don't know what's going on in Hollywood.
Nobody knows how to light a scene. I don't know.
Yeah, like what is it that I don't know, is it that like whatever like effect style is being used now, people haven't like adjusted lighting techniques to make it work, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think that could I mean I don't know enough about the specific technical nitty-gritty, but that would kind of make sense to me. Especially just considering how much of the image is like being sort of digitally constructed. It's like I feel like it's not just like filling in little details. It's like really having to create so much of the image in post-production that I just feel like it's hard for me to imagine that just doesn't like throw kind of a lot of things off. And there are these like kind of compelling images and stuff like you mentioned the pumpkins, and like some stuff like that. But I felt like it was a lot of missed potential. Honestly, there is some like interesting subtext. It's very gay coded. I felt like personally.
Yeah, we need to get to that real quick though on like the effects and stuff. To play devil's advocate, I agree they're not perfect, and like if they were practical, like I'm thinking about a movie we watched. Well, last week you had the Addams Family, and the week before we had The Witches, which are both two great practical effects movies. But the thing I did like about this movie is that at least it seems like they're trying he's trying with the VFX. Like I would give him it seems like they're trying more than like a Marvel movie to at least like create something that seems like, again, they're kind of going for the horror effect, but like you mentioned, I mean, we talked about the automatons. You had the automatons, you had the pumpkins, you had.
It is also very Return to Oz, movie we did in the first iteration.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like I'm not saying it's perfect, but I was like, I do appreciate this more than a lot of other movies that like lean on VFX, because I'm like, at least this one's trying to create stuff that's not just the same little green screen orb all over again.
Yeah, the design of like the actual design of stuff is pretty cool. Like the house doesn't look cool because of like the lighting problems I've talked about, but in terms of like what the house is and like how it's modeled, that looks pretty neat too. Like I think there's a lot of cool stuff in terms of like production design or whatever the digital version of that is.
And if anything, that I wish they, because I liked this well enough. I wasn't too sure about it. I liked it well enough though, and I appreciated that it like went as weird as you possibly could go, like in modern movie times. Because I'm surprised when we were talking in the break that like this did pretty well at the box office. Because I'm like, this seems like one that would just be kind of ignored today because it's too weird.
There's
you know, it's just too weird.
There's not a lot of like kids movies that I feel like really slot into the like live. I mean, I don't know. I feel like just the majority of kid marketed movies today are like entirely animated, and this sort of like, yeah, and this sort of like, you know, it's kind of edgy but also kind of kid friendly. It's like, I don't know how much.
No, I mean it's a disturbing movie a lot of times. Like, you know, it's like it's a very disturbing movie a lot of times, for at least, you know, like for a kids movie. Like that automaton scene is pretty freaking creepy because Steven Spielberg has a creepy ass collection of those things, I guess. But but no, like I think I was impressed with it because I do, even though there's some holes in it. The one thing I just wish is like you were talking about the house, Michael. I wish like the beginning of the movie we could have spent more like we kind of jump into the plot too quickly. I wish we could have spent some time just like being weird, and we're wasting time in the house, you know. Like last week we talked about this with Adam's Family, where, you know, 75% of that movie is just them dicking around, you know, doing stuff. And I'm like, I wish this movie could have just been like, you got Jack Black there, like just have weird time.
Well, and he's even introduced with like, he's like, there's no rules, kid, do whatever you want. And then there's not a lot of like no rulesing about.
Yeah, they jumped
like,
to the magic real quickly.
I wanted a little bit more of like, you know, they had the chair that was alive, which I thought was really cool, but I wanted a bit more of that like Beauty and the Beast, like anthropomorphized kind of shenanigans. Living things.
Yeah. The beginning of this movie is really weirdly paced. Like, for instance, like the kid shows up at the house and Jack Black's like talking. He's like, you know, what's your deal, kid, or whatever. And like the kid just starts crying.
That
like,
kid's
my parents
fucking
died in
annoying.
a car crash. And he's like, and then Jack Black's like, oh man, I'm sorry. And then they kind of move on. Like there's no like scene explaining like his parents dying or whatever. It's just like a weird bit of like exposition at the beginning of the movie. And then they're just like jumping in.
I'm surprised they don't show the parents die. It seems like Eli Roth would have given us just like a very disturbing scene of like a car crash.
I was like, is Kyle MacLachlan his dad? Like, I was kind of confused a little bit with that stuff. And also it's just like, I feel like there's a lot of like kids movies with like dead parents and stuff. I don't know.
I'm so tired of dead parent kids movies. Like, yeah, it's awful.
Just make Jack Black and Cate Blanchett is the parents.
But it also felt, well, speaking of that, like, you know, I mentioned the kind of gay coding a little bit, and I feel like it does, in addition to sort of interplaying with the like kind of Amblin type of subgenre, you know, being a sort of haunted house movie, I feel like it is a little bit in conversation with like the sort of older Hollywood kind of, you know, like The Uninvited, or even something like Rebecca a little bit, where I feel like there's just like a lot of, in those movies, like, you know, just the sort of trope of the like adult bachelor or single woman who's a spinster who lives in a spooky house alone, and it's kind of implied that they're probably gay, and especially just with the stuff here about like boy witches and you're the black swan, and just like also the friendship with the kid and the bully feels a little like, you know, their kids, it's not like sexual, but just a little bit like crushing vibes a little bit, and trying to like impress your crush by bringing the dead back to life.
There's like a little bit of like unrequited element of that, because they're like kind of friends when they're both outcasts at the beginning of the movie, and then the kid arm heals and he becomes like class president or something. And then it's like, bye-bye, Spectre.
What was holding him back was his arm broke, and they're like, I don't know about you.
Also, I thought it was funny that they're like, I don't know, it's kind of this like satirical element of this like social politicking like kid, because there's like the girl who's like, oh, he only becomes nice when he's like running for office or something like that.
Yeah. No, I could definitely see that, just because plus the relationship between the Cate Blanchett character and the Jack Black character, it's fun, but it's just definitely a different. It doesn't feel like it's feeding into a trope. Yeah, it's an odd thing. I mean, they like have prolonged scenes where they're just like yelling at each other, and you're like, oh, okay. Yeah. And even Kate Blanchett's character kind of just feels very aloof from anything like that.
I did think it was kind of, it doesn't necessarily really go anywhere, but it just in terms of like subtext, I was kind of interested that there's this sort of like, I felt like implied kind of Nazism to
that's all I want to talk about.
The Kyle MacLachlan character, where they're like, he was a warlock and he went to war in Germany and he got lost in the Black Forest and met a freaky little, I don't know, forest guy. Yeah, little Rip Van Winkle leprechaun.
Well,
dude, I don't know.
I was reading a bunch of like letterbox reviews who were saying that it's like this kind of like Holocaust allegory of like not like of like he saw just like this unimaginable evil, and so he like created this narrative in his mind to like wash that out because he just couldn't live with himself dealing with that, which I thought was a really interesting
scene
reading.
is like kind of crazy where they have the just like the B-roll newsreel World War II footage like playing over comic clock and like having this seizure in a field, and it's like kind of this weirdly like adult sort of expressive touch, but even though like the automaton part, it kind of feels a little bit like sort of reminds me of the whole golem like Jewish myth of the kind of living automaton made out of clay, and it's just kind of interesting because I feel like something like Inglourious Bastards, I feel like Eli Roth's performance in that, and just the movie in general, obviously gets talked a lot about in conversation with Jewish identity, but I feel like Eli Roth sometimes like something like, I don't know, just watching this movie and thinking about that sort of like Nazi and Holocaust imagery, I was kind of like, obviously in the context of the 2000s, like Hostel is in conversation with Iraq War and like the imagery of Abu Ghraib and things, but I was just like sort of looking back on it, I'm like, oh, there's clearly a sort of like Holocaust kind of subtext to, especially just like being Central Eastern Europe. The Hostel movies, there is this kind of like, I feel like it feels just a little bit sort of informed by like that historical trauma in a way.
Yeah, and there's like an element in the Hostel movies that I think is kind of, I don't know if it's intentionally in conversation with this movie, but like there is a sort of in both the Hostel movies that I saw, like the characters get into the situation, where they're in like the death cult or the like torture cult or whatever it is, and they all like have regrets about like in the second movie, it's like from the perspective of the like the actual torturers, and like one of the guys like keeps wanting to back out, but he keeps being like pulled into it. And then in the first movie, like there's like the like reluctance of this dude to like do like the frat boy like expat like kind of partying that the main characters want to do, and they're always being pulled into it. And by the like, there's a point in the movie where there's like a Rubicon that they cross where like undoing anything previously is like impossible, and like that's kind of like the horror of Hostel is like, even were these people to escape, which one of them does at the end of the first Hostel movie, there is like no undoing their getting involved with like this whole thing. And then like Kyle MacLachlan's plot, like the titular clock, is meant to like unmake the world, and so they can do the world again better the second time. Like there's a sort of like similar like penchant for like this unimaginable horror. Like the thing that you would want to do would be to undo it. Like that's like the strongest, like most natural urge. And like there's a sort of like impossibility that it can be undone in real life. And in this movie, it's kind of interesting because like there's a like it's portrayed as like genocidal to want to undo like the world because he doesn't want to remake the world with humans in it, which is kind of weird and fucked up. But
there's something just with the sort of superhero movie-ish visual quality. There's something very kind of like Thanos or like some of the like DC movies. It's like a kind of supervillain element.
Well, it also has this whole element of like being this, to a degree, 50s period piece, but it's, and I saw this reading on Letterboxd as well, where it's like it's this 1950s period piece movie, but you're not reckoning with anything that would actually be going on in like 1950s America. Like they have a whole conversation about a water fountain at a school, and it's not the conversation you would have been having in the 50s. It's that there's no like soda in it or whatever, and they say, and like there's like a scene where the kids are lined up just kind of yelling like water fountain water, and it's just kind of this weird, it's almost like this like whole, like the whole thing's like this kind of alternate reality type situation.
And
Does it even like take place
it's in Michigan,
like, explicitly,
and it's an integrated high school.
But it's like,
which I guess wouldn't have been unusual in the 50s in Michigan, maybe, but even so, it's weird.
It's like, it's not like they have to have a whole thing to like, but it's just, it's just a very unacknowledged, like, yeah, this is a messy period in American history.
It's a little like Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. In some ways, I don't know.
But no, if you kind of look at it like through this lens of like this is the alternate reality that they're in, but even though you kind of have like this ideal state where like you're not having the kind of civil unrest of the 50s and 60s, but you still have the Holocaust that has happened, and like you have to, and you're trying, it's like there's never, it's like there's never going to be this reality where everything is just going to be perfectly laid out. Like, even though you have, more perfect integration in this reality that we're living in this movie, you still have the Holocaust that happened. So it's just kind of like, we just have to clear everything out. It's this constant like fighting with there's always a bit of evil somewhere.
There's always a
TikTok.
That's right. There's always.
That's the movie. Thanks, everybody. Yeah. But no, I think that kind of adds to almost like the unnerving quality of it. Like it's just kind of this like unbalanced state to it that makes it. I don't know if it necessarily adds to it, but it makes it interesting. It makes it much more interesting than like than a lot of other equivalent movies that are coming out around this time.
Yeah, in fact, speaking of Thanos, 2018, isn't that the year of the snap? Like the Thanos, that is kind of like a weird like comparison, because this is I remember when I saw I can't remember the name of the movie. Infinity War. I remember when I saw Infinity War, I was like left thinking like, this is a movie that's so full of like kooky elements, but they're not allowed to be kooky. Like all the superheroes have these really bizarre powers because they're like kind of space gods and like radioactive people and all that sort of stuff. But they all do the same thing, which is like punch and then like shoot energy from their fists. And it is kind of interesting to compare it to this movie, in which like, it's not like an amazing movie, and like as we talked about, the effects aren't amazing, but there is still like a vivaciousness and interesting like quality about it that like is kind of in reference, like in conversation with the Marvel movies in a way. Like, I mean, like the snap versus like the undoing the world sort of thing, but also just like, I don't know, like there's zapping magic in this movie too, but then there's like interesting permutations on that, or even just like the freaking creatures, like the cat that like just farts leaves, like the hedgerow cat, or like the pumpkins the pumpkins are interesting because they're like CGI, but they vomit like practical goo, I think, on the characters. And I mean, it's not like amazing. It's not like, he mentioned Sam Raimi, and it, I can imagine like the classic Sam Raimi movies have this kind of chaotic, like, smorgasbord of creatures that is much more interesting. But at the same time, like compared to like what a kind of studio, like, middle school audience movie, like it does have some signs of life that are abnormal.
Yeah, I don't, I enjoyed it well enough. It's not great. It's still, it still has its holes, but like I do appreciate that like Eli Roth's like kind of going for it, and it doesn't all work, but he did go for it, And like and honestly, at this point, it's kind of like the thing that people talk about with a lot of movies, that there's not many people going for it, especially like kind of like this is a in theaters mainstream like mass produced movie through Universal and Amblin. And it's like being weird and strange and not necessarily like trying to meet its audience. It's just kind of going, I'm this way and you can deal with it. And that's not necessarily what you see in theaters. You know, a lot of it's trying to kind of give people the experience that they're expected what they're expecting when they go in the door.
Well, I think like there's elements of this movie that are kind of like capitulating to audience expectations, and they're the most like tedious elements of the movie. Like one of the reviews mentioned like how goofy Jack Black is, and like it's Jack Black, so of course he's gonna be goofy, and I don't have a problem with that. But like some of the dialogue that he is doing is like feels very like 2010s family blockbuster kind of like dialogue, and
that's gotta hurt.
Right, exactly. You know, like it's like constantly stuff like that, and like that really took me out of the movie in a way. Like Cate Blanchett is allowed to be kind of like steely and cold, and she kind of like pulls that off. But Jack Black understood kind of mugging a little bit. I think Jack Black understood the assignment too, because like that's what he's doing. But I just don't like the assignment.
Yeah, he does kind of. I mean, as much as I love him, he does have sometimes one note that he.
Yeah, I mean, I like Jack Black. I'm a big fan of Jack Black, but he's like a little much here, and he's not a little much because he's Jack Black. He's a little bit much because of the material that he's been given. Like, I don't know. Like, I like Jack Black as like the kooky like Merlin uncle type guy. Like that's like a fun role. It's just like some of the specific things. Like another thing, like I mean, this is kind of like just funny. But like there's a part in the movie where Jack Black's like, I gotta pee, and he says that for like no apparent reason, except like it's kind of like a laugh line. And later in the scene, he like turns into a baby and pees, and like the act of him turning into a baby is very funny and weird. But him peeing is like, I don't know, like to me that feels like, again, like kind of.
Can we address the surrealness of when Jack Black turns into a baby and keeps his head, but is on a newborn baby's body?
The part I couldn't look away from was the neck, because the neck was like it had to connect to the baby's body. It was out there.
So it's like somewhere you can like probably go to an auction of Hollywood props and buy that.
I would do that too. That would be insane.
It's like how I feel like I've seen like a listing for like the naked body of Sylvester Stallone in Demolition Man, like in cryogenic freezing, and I feel like it would be one of those really just like bizarre things.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare this movie to The Witches. Like we compared this I think like very briefly to The Munsters, because that's like, you know, Rob Zombie doing a kids movie. But I think The Witches is an interesting comparison because that's Nicholas Roeg doing a kids movie, and I think like The Witches is a more interesting movie than this movie, but I think the effects are kind of the same in the sense of when I watch The Witches, and maybe y'all feel different, but when I watch The Witches, I can see the Nicholas Roeg weirdness in it, but I'm also a little bit like, there's elements of the movie that are kind of tedious and boring to me in The Witches because of the way that it has to like just kind of capitulate to a certain like expectations of, I don't know, The Witches is a weird movie, but it does kind of have because of not just it being Roald Dahl, but because of the kind of like era of movie it's coming out in, it's got like a kind of like it feels like a family movie from the 1980s or 90s in some degree. Like the kid, you know, I think the kids are all irritating in these movies, and that's the problem.
I was gonna say the kid's fucking annoying in The Witches. So if you have an annoying ass kid,
annoying in a House of the Clock in its walls, like maybe it's that, like maybe it's that like having the young like audience surrogate kids.
He has like such a like you just want to slap the shit out of him when he cries.
You know what this movie also kind of reminded me of in terms of like kind of annoying kids? Hugo. This to me felt like Eli Roth's Hugo. Fucking Asa Butterfield or whatever his name is. Little Ender's Game over here. Okay, buddy. What is he up to now?
I have no idea.
I'll look for you, but Asa Butterfield. Oh, he's in that sex education show.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
Yeah. Also, connecting back to the whole thing about the Holocaust was The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is a reprehensible movie that we should arrest him for.
Oh wow!
Also, Ender's Game is about Hitler, kinda. So.
The House with a Clock in Its Walls. The kid is from Daddy's Home, and Daddy's Home too.
Oh, they brought him back.
Well, Daddy's not home anymore because he died in the car crash.
Oh no!
He's also in the movie Team Marco. What is Finding Ohana?
I don't know what any of these.
The first
Fun Mom Dinner.
Finding Ohana.
Mother's Day. That's one of those.
All of these movies have parents in the titles. Daddy's Home, Mother's Day, Fun Mom Dinner, Daddy's Home 2. Like
Finding Ohana. Ohana means family. Family means nobody gets left behind or forgotten.
Jeez.
Oh my god.
This kid's got a type. No, he's terrible. He was bad. The kid,
Yeah.
and then the broken arm kid, also awful.
The wrong kid died.
Yeah, the wrong kid died. But no, the arm kid is awful. He sounds like he's like had like
What else
3
was he in?
antidepressants and he was acting.
Oh my god, he's the kid from mid-90s.
He
No
is.
way.
That's what
He
he
is,
was.
yeah.
And Killing of a Sacred Deer. And he's in the God of War.
He's a Dwayne in that game too.
3 of the games. Wow. That would suck to just like your job is to be an annoying child actor.
I feel like that's like at least 50% of the child actor roles.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely most of them. Like the kid, Spritle from Speed Racer, that kid.
Yeah, so I don't know. I guess the moral of the story is that, like, and we kind of invite these sorts of movies with our series Horror for Kids, but it's conceptually interesting to have, like, an adult film, not adult film, like an adult director. To have an adult
It is interesting to have an
House
adult.
with a cock in its walls.
house with a cock and balls.
I bet Jack Black's character would like that.
Yeah, he's doing something in there.
But anyway, like, I don't know, like, I guess you brought up Hugo, and I think that's maybe, like, one of the better case scenarios of these, but, like, I don't know that I've seen, like, the movie where the, like, serious adult director directs, like, a kid's movie. I'm trying to think of the one where that it's like, wow, that's really, like, an indispensable part of this director's, like, oeuvre, you know?
I haven't seen it, but I know some people say that Fritz Lang's Moonfleet is like secretly his best, his kind of kids pirate movie. But that's going way back.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
yeah, I
like
don't know
Terry
either.
Gilliam with Time Bandits. People really like Time Bandits.
Kind of all his movies are kids.
Yeah,
movies.
some of his movies are just R-rated Time
And
Bandits.
that's the thing. Yeah, that's the thing. Like Spielberg, obviously has like very adult movies, but I also feel like he's not like, it's not like he did one, juvenile movie, the BFG.
Well, he's known for like, kind of having kids, like E.T. and Jurassic Park and Raiders, and I mean, like, those movies are not adult, like, that's what he's known for. And then he started making, other stuff. Then he was like, let me just drop Schindler's List and Jurassic Park
It's
on
got
the
a
same
kind
week.
of Robert Zemeckis vibe.
Yeah,
But he
I don't
makes
know.
a lot of kids movies.
Maybe.
Well, he had Pinocchio taking a shit in the new movie, so
Genius.
he's got to
Speaking
go.
of witches, he did that remake that I don't think anybody saw.
He did, yeah. Any final thoughts on House with a
It's
Clock on its
fine.
Walls? I think it's worth checking out.
Yeah, I think if it came out in 2009, it would have starred Freddie Highmore. That's my take.
Are you talking about what the hell was that show he was
August
in?
Rush.
Oh my god.
No. Is it The Good Doctor? Yeah,
Good
The
Doctor,
yeah.
The Good Doctor.
fucking Finding Neverland or whatever.
Arthur and the Invisibles, the Spiderwick Chronicles.
This does also have a series of unfortunate events kind of vibe. I didn't realize that I don't think I read the book. I didn't realize that the art was by Edward Gorey, though, who I was a big fan of when I was a kid. I remember, I think I learned like about his work from the Masterpiece Mystery PBS like opening credits, and I just really like that kind of like macabre, morbid, whimsical type stuff when I was like early teens, and I don't know where I was going with that.
I have a final. Yeah.
Series of unfortunate events. It's got that.
I have a final thought, which is that like we're in a weird phase of like cinema and cinephilia at the moment, in which like there are like so few movies, or there are fewer movies released, and this was true in 2018, but it's especially true now because of COVID and stuff. But there are fewer movies released, and also you have this kind of like overriding like studio aesthetic that is kind of like overbearing. And I think that we've like adopted like a sliding scale for what we consider interesting. Like you mentioned this movie being,
people love the most mid shit.
You mentioned like this movie being released in 2009, and I think if this movie were released in 2009, it would be unremarkable, like completely unremarkable.
Well, it would probably be one of those things like The Mummy or like The Mask of Zorro or like the first Pirates of the Caribbean, where people are like, oh, you know, actually looking back on it, like that was pretty good. You know, that was some competent filmmaking. Like that's what people would say about The House with the Clock in its Walls. Like this is some competent filmmaking. Like by the standards of today, this is better than most.
I will
things,
go to bat for the Pirates movies, but like I think a lot of those other movies, like like there's like a. Like, if this weren't directed by Eli Roth, I would never watch this movie. And even with it being directed by Eli Roth, like, I had to constantly remind myself, like, I'm interested in this because it's an Eli Roth movie, and therefore I was looking for those weird, like, little, like, Holocaust things.
Tourism.
But had I not had that context, and if I were just, like, 19, seeing this with, like, my little brother in 2009, like, I would have forgotten about this movie. And I think... I don't know. It's like this interesting thing in which, like, I don't know. Every era like looks back to previous eras and looks at like kinds of media that don't get made very much anymore and has a kind of nostalgia for them. But like cinephilia right now is in like a overdrive of that, and like that's not all bad. Like it's cool that we can like just appreciate like mid rom-coms for what they are, rather than like, you know, hating their kind of ubiquity in the 2000s. Like, I mean, there's value in like appreciating things that aren't like, you know, like these like visionary masterpieces or whatever. But it is kind of weird that, I don't know, like this is not like I didn't feel like this was a super engaging movie. It's like fine, but like it feels more interesting than it should be because we don't get movies with even this like little smidge of personality very much anymore.
All right. I'm gonna put a stake in this one. And I'll wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter and Instagram at Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we list all the movies that we talked about in this episode. If you'd like to support the show, go to patreon.com/Cinematary. Whether it's 1, 5, or whatever, you can just if you feel like shouting out the show. Thank you to our patrons Cam, Chad Newsom, Corey Willingham, Candace Sisson, Ron Hayes, Teresa Marsathi, Titus Arthur, and Tyler Chandler. Thank you so much for your patronage. Next week, we're going to be concluding our Horror for Kids series with this year's Wendell and Wild, which comes out on Friday. So go give it a watch before we do the episode. Until then, Wendell and we're getting wild. Wild and out. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.